The people that are part of this movement that's called the Taliban, right? And we have in this country equated the Taliban with Al-Qaeda, even though the Taliban never attacked us. And because of that, we have pushed the Taliban and Al-Qaeda into each other's arms. We've made what wasn't a reality when we first went into Afghanistan a reality because we went into Afghanistan. Now the Taliban and Al-Qaeda are working together because they have a common enemy, us. Here's the problem with the Taliban. The Taliban are made up principally of an ethnic group in that country called the Pashtuns, also known as the Pathans. Now, these people are the majority of the Afghan population. This is already what makes our situation in Afghanistan so difficult. President Obama, in that speech we quoted to you, says they're on the road to free and fair elections. They're going to have a democracy. They're going to pick the people they want to run the country. Ladies and gentlemen, what do you do when the people that are the majority group in that country are the very people making up the groups like the Taliban that we're at war with? If you make that country into a real democracy, they're going to vote for the very people we're bombing right now. Bingo. That shows you what we're up against. It also shows you the inherent dishonesty of the whole idea, because the administration knows this. They understand that if this thing is a free and fair democracy, we shouldn't be fighting there. All right, now, the people that are running that government, now Hamid Karzai, who is he's a puppet, let's just be honest. He's a Pashtun, ethnically speaking, but that's why he's where he is. He's a Pashtun because we know that the country's majority Pashtun. We realize that the guy who's running the country has to be from the majority ethnic group. But a lot of the guys who pull the levers underneath him are Tajik and even Uzbek. These are groups that the Pashtuns have historic problems with. And the warlords that Karzai is working with to maintain his power are, well, they're as nasty people as the people that, make up the Taliban. That's the problem, we had in Vietnam as well, is that the guys we were working with to defeat the bad guys are bad guys themselves. In other words, you get involved in this conflict and your hands are going to be dirty no matter which side you back. Not just that, the region has important players around the region that are undercutting our effort there. I mean, one of the important ones is Pakistan. Pakistan is a huge wild card in this area, ladies and gentlemen. The Taliban, by and large, was supported in their rise to power by elements within the Pakistani Secret Service, who continue to have a soft spot in their heart for the Taliban. The Taliban and Al-Qaeda, when they're trying to get away from our people, where do they run to? They run to the wild badlands, the border areas in places like Waziristan, in the Pakistan-Afghan border area. Robert Fisk wrote a great piece back in April, the British columnist, where he was saying that if you go to that region and you talk to the people who are Pashtun, they don't recognize that Afghan-Pakistani border anyway. They've been crossing that border for thousands of years, before some guy in Europe somewhere drew a map saying this is the border between these two countries. They don't care. They go back and forth. This reminds me so much, ladies and gentlemen, of the conflict we had with the Apache back in the late 1800s in the United States. The Apache were so difficult for us to deal with for all sorts of reasons. One, they were incredible guerrilla fighters, like the Afghans. They lived in ferociously difficult terrain, like the Afghans. And then they had a border that they could use to their own advantage, the Mexican-U.S. border, where if the U.S. was chasing them and pressuring them, they'd just hop on over the border into Mexico, get some sanctuary because of that international line that they didn't recognize, but everybody else did. And then when the Mexicans pressed them too much from the south, they'd jump over the border back into the United States. That's just what the Afghans do as well. The difference, of course, was twofold. One, the Apaches did not have modern weapons the way the Afghans do. They didn't have access to cannons. They didn't have that kind of thing. Second is that the Apaches were always outnumbered. You had 300, 400, 500, 600 American and Mexican soldiers for every Apache, or worse, right? And look how much trouble they caused. Ladies and gentlemen, there are 40 million Pashtuns in the region around Afghanistan. Not all in Afghanistan, but that's the population of this important ethnic group to that region. 40 million. If we put the extra troops in that area, we're planning on putting into that area, we will up the troop deployment numbers to somewhere around 110,000, 120,000 people. 120,000 to deal with an enemy 40 million strong. Now, let's back up a minute, because you will talk to people who will try to explain to you why this situation is not like all the other situations in Afghanistan's history. Afghanistan has a reputation. It's called the graveyard of empires. empires. It has kicked out much more sophisticated, nuanced empires than our own. For example, they kicked out the British after destroying a British army in the middle 1800s, an entire British army. The British were probably the most sophisticated nation in world history at keeping tribal peoples pacified and maintaining a light hold over all these regions. They weren't able to do it in the 1800s, right? They left the region. Kipling wrote a wonderful poem talking about a tombstone white for the man who tries to hustle the East about the situation in Afghanistan. Go read your Kipling. He's a little bit colonial, a little bit racist, a little bit dated, but oh so, relevant when it comes to Afghanistan. The Soviet Union tried to do it in a more direct way when they invaded the area in 1979 with armored spearheads and helicopter gunships and all this stuff, and they were thrown out of the area. By the way, this is important because the reason they were thrown out of the area has a lot to do with the current situation. But let's just say that the situation each time, whether it was the British or the Soviets, was that the historic Afghan quagmire didn't apply to these people because modern technology made those old rules invalid. British technology and British riflery and all this stuff was going to negate the idea that this area couldn't be pacified, right? The Soviet Union with helicopters and planes and bombs and tanks was going to nullify the idea that this area couldn't be pacified. When I talk to American military folks, and we'll discuss this area, they will talk about the modern technology we have. Well, you've got the drones, and you've got the satellites, and you've got the infrared and the night vision and all this stuff. Those old rules, Dan, don't apply anymore, which is what everyone else said in the history of Afghanistan. And now our military, even with all these things at their disposal, is putting up the red flag saying, warning, warning, the situation in Afghanistan is looking bad. Well, we have all that stuff, ladies and gentlemen. How can the situation be looking that bad? Now, when the Soviets went into Afghanistan, we in this country got the bright idea. Remember, that's why the United States did not participate in the 1980 Olympics, right? It was a protest against their invasion of Afghanistan. So the Soviets go into Afghanistan to prop up a government there, or to install a new government there, to protect socialism. It was called the Brezhnev Doctrine. And we begin funneling arms to guerrilla groups in that country. We bring in clandestine advisors from the CIA. We give arms and weapons and training and organization to a bunch of groups that became known as the Mujahideen, the Islamic guerrilla fighters. It took them, almost 10 years, but they threw the Soviets out of that area. Now, here's the problem, ladies and gentlemen. When they threw the Soviets out of the area, they didn't just disband and go home. Matter of fact, for years, and maybe even now, we were so worried about the Stinger missiles, which are the shoulder-fired anti-aircraft missiles, that we gave to them and what would become of them now. We were worried it's going to, and we still are worried, it may shoot down a jetliner at some point, because we gave all these important, nasty weapons to the Islamic guerrilla fighters, who, once the Soviets were kicked out, became free agents, essentially. The people around Osama bin Laden, and yes, Osama bin Laden himself, were made by our country in an effort to create a force that could counteract the Soviet Union. Now, folks, now that we've created this force, we built the monster that is Afghanistan as it is right now, okay? Now we're trying to tame this monster ourselves. So why are we there? This gets us back to the whole geopolitical thing. When the two buildings fell down on 9/11, President Bush made a statement that seems like one of the dumbest statements he ever made. He said after 9/11 that the terrorists hate us because they hate our freedom. They attacked us because they hate our freedom. And the reason that's a dumb statement is because it has nothing to do with why they hate us and why they fight us. They don't hate us because of our freedoms. But if President Bush had actually said why they fight us, this country would be asking some very hard, in-depth, soul-searching questions of the sort that the administration, the last administration, and maybe the current administration, wouldn't want us asking. What if President Bush had come up and said the truth about why we were attacked on 9/11? Comes up there and gives a speech and says to the American people that the terrorists in the Middle East hate us because we're in the Middle East. That's the truth, ladies and gentlemen.